Welcome to The Debate. Today, we are stripping language down to its raw mechanics. We're going to be looking at the architecture of the spoken word, specifically the friction that exists between, the speed of our thoughts and the movement of our tongues. We're analyzing a fascinating piece of source material that tackles the single greatest source of anxiety for language learners, the pause.
Yeah, and it's a really compelling premise. The material argues that hesitation, silence, those, agonizing seconds of mental translation, that those are the primary barriers to what we call natural speech.
Mm-hmm.
But that brings us to the central question we need to wrestle with today. Is the elimination of pauses and the pursuit of continuous, unbroken flow, is that truly the ultimate metric of language mastery? Or does this relentless emphasis on speed and filler words actually sacrifice precision for the sake of just making noise?
It's a fundamental clash, really. And I'm firmly in the camp that fluency is, functionally defined by flow. If you look at the source material, it correctly identifies that the barriers to speech are rarely just not knowing the word. The barriers are psychological: fear, perfectionism, the paralysis of analysis. The material argues we have to overcome this through behavioral conditioning, things like shadowing and filling the dead air to build confidence.
And I'm coming at it from, a different angle. I believe that pausing is a necessary cognitive function, not a defect. While the source material offers some very practical drills, which I'm sure we'll get into, I worry that its heavy emphasis on speed conversation and not aiming for perfection encourages a kind of superficial fluency. It prioritizes the appearance of speaking over the actual act of communicating precise meaning.
Okay, so look, I see why you might think that. But let's just break down the diagnosis the source material provides. They lay out 4 reasons why people pause: lack of confidence, vocabulary gaps, overthinking, specifically translating from a native language, and just plain nervousness. And I think this analysis is spot on.
Mm-hmm.
The source describes a learner who is second-guessing themselves, asking, is this the right word, while the conversation has already moved on. That right there is a failure of communication.
I don't deny that those are the causes. My concern is more with the implication that the solution is to just, to stop thinking. The source says fluency is not about perfection, it's about flow. And that sounds inspiring, but it's a dangerous, slippery slope. If you prioritize flow over the correct selection of words, you aren't becoming fluent. You're just becoming faster at being wrong.
But you have to start somewhere. The source argues that the fear of making mistakes is what slows people down. It creates a bottleneck. By prioritizing flow, you bypass the fear center of the brain. The material explicitly states that silence in conversation is often perceived as a lack of competence or extreme nervousness. If I'm speaking to you and I stop for 5 seconds to conjugate a verb, I've broken the social contract of the conversation.
Or, you're showing respect for the listener by trying to find the accurate term. However, I will concede that the source makes a strong point about the mechanics of overthinking. They mention that learners get stuck trying to translate sentences from their native language, which has different structures. That cognitive load, doing double the work, is undeniably a hurdle.
Exactly. And that leads to their proposed solution, which I find brilliant in its simplicity: thinking in English.
Right. So let's dig into that, because that is our first core point of debate. The psychology of translation versus thinking in English.
Right. So the source gives us very specific, very actionable technique. They suggest describing your immediate surroundings to train the brain. You walk down the street and you think, the sun is shining, or the weather is warm, or I see a dog running. You aren't translating le soleil brille and then converting it. You are mapping the visual stimulus directly to the English syntax. This eliminates that translation gap, which is the primary mechanical cause of those unnatural pauses.
I agree that thinking in English is the gold standard. When you map concept to word rather than word to word, you gain efficiency. But I really have to challenge the practicality of this for learners who are suffering from vocabulary gaps, which is another cause the source identified. If I look at a specific breed of dog and I don't know the word Dalmatian, or I don't know the word for excavator, trying to think in English leads to the very silence you're trying to avoid. You just hit a wall.
That's an interesting point, though. Look, the source anticipates this. They don't say stop if you don't know the word. They advocate for a technique linguists call circumlocution. They use the specific example of a refrigerator. If you forget the word refrigerator, you don't stand there in silence, scrolling through your mental dictionary. You say, the machine that keeps food cold.
The machine that keeps food cold.
Yes, exactly. It maintains the flow. It maintains the connection. If you pause to search for a refrigerator, or worse, pull out your phone to translate it, the communicative bond is snapped. By describing the function, you stay in the moment. That is fluency.
Ideally, yes, but consider the cognitive load of circumlocution. That's actually much higher than simple retrieval. If I'm a nervous learner, which the source says is a major factor, and I forget the word refrigerator, asking me to suddenly construct a whole relative clause like the machine that keeps food cold might be asking too much. I might just say the cold box.
And the cold box is better than 10 seconds of silence. That's the argument. It's about utility. If I'm your host and you ask for the cold box, I know what you mean. If you say nothing, I'm confused. It's all about keeping the ball in the air. The source is arguing that the worst thing you can do is drop the ball.
I understand the utility argument, but let's look at the long-term effect. If I always rely on circumlocution, do I ever actually learn the word refrigerator? Or do I just become really good at describing appliances? There's a risk that this strategy, while useful in an emergency, becomes a crutch that prevents vocabulary expansion.
I disagree. The source pairs this with active vocabulary building, but in the moment of speaking, the priority is connection. And this brings us to the second major tool the source suggests, which I know you have strong feelings about: filler words.
Yes, the ums, the ahs, and the you-knows. The source explicitly advises using words like well, you know, actually, and so, too, and I'm quoting here, give your brain a second to think without creating an awkward silence.
I think this is one of the most practical pieces of advice in the material. It's actionable immediately. It gives the learner a safety net.
I strongly disagree. I think it's mimicking the sound of fluency without the substance. It's a cosmetic fix for a structural problem. It's like putting a racing stripe on a car with a broken engine. It looks faster, but it isn't going anywhere.
But native speakers use them all the time. The source points this out repeatedly. We don't speak in these perfectly drafted paragraphs. We say, well, I think, or, it's like. The source argues that these fillers serve a vital function. They signal to the listener, I'm not finished speaking, I'm just processing. It prevents the listener from interrupting. It holds the floor. That's a crucial social skill in a second language.
There's a profound difference between a native speaker using well to signal a complex shift in argumentation and a learner using, actually, to mask the fact that they're lost in the sentence. The native speaker uses fillers to manage the rhythm of the conversation. The learner, following this advice, uses them to hide. It encourages filling space rather than becoming comfortable with a thoughtful pause. A pause can be powerful. A pause can be authoritative. Well is never authoritative.
I'm not convinced by that because we're talking about learners who are paralyzed by perfectionism. You're holding them to a standard of rhetoric that even most native speakers don't meet. The source isn't telling them to give a TED Talk. It's telling them how to survive a casual conversation. If saying actually gives their brain the 500 milliseconds it needs to retrieve the next verb, that is a successful strategy. It keeps the other person engaged.
It masks the jagged edges, it doesn't smooth them. But okay, let's move to the physical aspect of this, because the source proposes some very mechanical training methods, specifically shadowing.
Yes, shadowing. This is where the behavioral conditioning really comes in. The source describes this as listening to a native speaker and repeating what they say immediately, like an echo.
It just sounds exhausting. And honestly, a bit mindless.
But it's necessary. Speech is a physical act. It involves the tongue, the lips, your breath control. Shadowing trains the muscle memory. The source argues this forces you to speak quickly and smoothly without pausing because you don't have time to pause. You're riding the wave of the native speaker's rhythm. It addresses the nervousness factor by making the act of speaking automatic.
I can see the value in prosody learning the rhythm and intonation. However, I question the cognitive engagement. If I'm just parroting a podcast host immediately, Am I actually processing the syntax, or am I just a human tape recorder? You can shadow a language you don't even understand if you have a good ear. That doesn't mean you can speak it.
But you're internalizing the patterns. You're feeling how the sentence falls. You're learning that the voice goes down at the end of a statement and up at the end of a question. You can't learn that from a textbook. You have to feel it in your mouth.
Perhaps. But then the source pivots to this other exercise, conversation anticipation. This is where you try to guess the speaker's next word or phrase. And the source claims this trains your brain to think ahead. I'm sorry, I just don't buy that as a speaking exercise. That is a listening exercise.
It's a bridge to speaking. Think about why we pause. We pause because we don't know what comes next. If you train your brain to predict, in my opinion, when you hear in my, you are learning to process language in chunks rather than individual words.
Chunks.
Yes, the source makes a big deal about learning phrases instead of words. They argue that instead of memorizing opinion, you memorize in my opinion. That way, when you speak, you're retrieving 1 unit of information, not 3. That drastically reduces the cognitive load, which reduces the need to pause. Anticipation drills train that chunking ability.
Okay, I will concede that chunking is scientifically valid. If you treat in my opinion as a single lexeme, you're more efficient. That's undeniable. My concern is that prediction is passive. Generating language under pressure when it's your turn to speak is a completely different neurological pathway than guessing what someone else is about to say. You're comparing catching a ball to throwing one.
But the source pairs this with the 1-minute speaking challenge. That's the active generation part. And this brings us to the most controversial point, the conflict between perfectionism and communication.
This is where I struggle the most with the material. The source suggests picking a topic and speaking for 1 full minute without stopping. And the instruction is explicit. Keep going even if you make mistakes.
And I applaud that instruction. That is the only way to break the ice.
I find it perilous. If you're practicing mistakes for the sake of continuity, you're reinforcing those mistakes. You are practicing the error. If I spend a minute saying I good to the store and I eated breakfast just to keep the timer running, I am fossilizing those grammatical errors.
You're missing the forest for the trees here. The source material identifies the fear of making mistakes as the paralysis point. It says fluency is not about perfection. If the listener understands I eated breakfast, then communication has occurred. The goal of the 1-minute challenge is to break the psychological dam. You can clean up the grammar later, but you cannot fix a sentence that was never spoken.
But can you clean it up later? Unlearning a fossilized error is incredibly difficult. And the source also suggests speed conversation practice with a 2-minute timer. It says the goal is to respond quickly without overthinking. When you remove the time to think, you remove nuance, you remove complexity, you force the learner into the simplest structures just to beat the clock.
But real life is a clock. Real conversation doesn't wait for you to craft a perfect sentence. The source is preparing learners for the reality of the street, not the classroom. They even suggest using speech-to-text apps for real-time feedback. That's a check on accuracy, isn't it?
That is the one saving grace in the exercise list. Speech-to-text is a cruel but effective master. If Siri can't understand you, you know your pronunciation is off. But even there, the source frames it as a way to check fluency, not necessarily grammatical structure. The app might transcribe your broken grammar perfectly, validating the error. It might type, I ate breakfast, because it heard you clearly, not because you were right.
I think you're underestimating the value of momentum. The source mentions the mindset shift. Focus on communication, not perfection. They argue that if you speak with energy and confidence, people focus on the message, not the mistakes. This is objectively true. Confidence covers a multitude of sins. If I say I eat breakfast with a smile and keep the story moving, you're listening to the story. If I stop and look down, the interaction dies.
Confidence is important, yes. But confidence derived from competence is durable. Confidence derived from fake it till you make it is fragile. The source says, mistakes help you improve. That is only true if you identify and correct the mistake. If the exercise is don't stop, just keep talking, where is the correction mechanism?
The correction comes from exposure. The source emphasizes active listening and imitating native speakers alongside these drills. If you're doing that, the self-correction happens naturally over time. but you have to be speaking to self-correct. If you are silent, you aren't even playing the game.
I suppose that is the crux of it. Is it better to play the game poorly than to not play at all?
According to the source, absolutely. It's about volume of practice. The more you speak, even imperfectly, the more data your brain has to work with.
Let's look at the story retelling exercise they mention. Listen to a short story and then retell it. This, to me, strikes me as the most balanced approach in the whole material.
Why is that?
Because you're constrained by the narrative. You have to convey specific information, the plot. So you can't just blather, but you have to use your own words. It requires memory, structure, and vocabulary. It's harder to fake fluency when you have to explain what happened in the movie you just watched. You can't just rely on filler words, you need the actual nouns and verbs of the story.
I agree. It forces you to think in English about the sequence of events. It combines the vocabulary retrieval with the flow. And notice, the source says to do this in your own words, not just memorizing the script. That forces that internal bypass of translation that we discussed earlier. You're taking the concept of the story and encoding it into speech.
True. It pushes the brain to conceptualize the event, not just the words of the event. It bridges the gap between the chunking we discussed and the creative generation of speech. The idea is there, you just need the wrapper.
We're nearing the end of our analysis, but I want to touch on one final thing the source mentions regarding the why. They list nervousness and pressure. They say when people feel pressured, their brains don't work as fast. This is the fight or flight response.
Which is ironic, considering their solution is to add a timer.
Touché. But think about it. If you practice under the artificial pressure of a timer, the natural pressure of a social interaction feels less daunting. It's stress inoculation training. If you can handle the panic of the 1-minute challenge where you have to keep talking no matter what, you can handle ordering a coffee.
That is a fair argument. Hard training makes for an easy fight. It's the same logic as sparring in boxing. It's messy, but it prepares you for the ring.
Exactly. The source is essentially saying, get in the ring. Stop reading about boxing and get in the ring.
So as we wrap up, where do we land? I look at this source material, and I see a very, aggressive, very modern approach to language. It treats language as a sport. Speed, agility, keeping the ball moving.
And I think that is exactly what the modern learner needs. The source successfully argues that flow is the gateway to confidence. You cannot think your way to fluency. You have to speak your way there. Techniques like shadowing and thinking in English are designed to stop the brain from doing that exhausting double work of translation. The material's a manifesto for getting out of your own way.
I will grant you that the psychological barriers are real. And the advice to learn phrases, not just words, is undeniable. But I still hold that we must be careful not to vilify the pause. Silence can be thoughtful. Silence is where the right word lives. If we fill every silence with, well, we lose something. But I will admit, if the choice is between a clumsy, noisy conversation and a perfect silent one, well, the noisy one is the only one that actually connects two human beings.
Well said. And that is the ultimate lesson from this material, isn't it? Fluency is presented here not just as a skill, but as a mindset. Specifically, the willingness to prioritize connection over grammatical precision.
Indeed. It asks the listener to make a choice. Are you pausing to think, or are you pausing out of fear?
A question worth answering. That does it for this edition of The Debate. We'll see you next time.